Right now, we're interacting with our audience and coaching, and this book was perfect timing for a lot of people to find meaning in this massive change of their lives and their lifestyle. A different form of captivity, certainly, than the prison camps of Auschwitz and what your grandfather went through and what he ultimately survived. But the dots were connected through this book and the meaning that he found in that captivity and that event. So connecting the dots to what's going on today, that'd be kind of an interesting place to start our conversation.
Yeah. Well, I think suffering and any kind of suffering in this situation where we're now suddenly find ourselves limited in so many ways in our lives, that was the central topic that he wrote about all his life, actually before the Holocaust as well. How do we deal with the changes, the difficult situations, the unavoidable sufferings that we are confronted with in lives? He actually spoke of the tragic triad, the three things that are unavoidable in life. And those are suffering that you cannot avoid, of course. Then death. Might it be the death of a beloved person or your own death, your own mortality, and guilt, another strong element that pushes us to the brink. So these are the three elements that life simply doesn't come without. It's part of the deal. We all have to face it sooner or later. And how do we say yes to life, right? Despite the fact that we are confronted with these things. And so in a way, this situation now is not much different. I think it's part of the reason why people have been drawn to this book for so many decades now, is because they find something in there that instills hope and tells them, your life might be not the way you expected it, but that doesn't mean that it's not meaningful.
That's really cool. And so you said you were 19 when you sort of dove into this book for the first time, which I think is an incredible thing. So for you, was it a pivot point? Did you, by taking this, clearly you took a track of, almost carrying the torch, sharing this incredible message with the world. What was that realization like? Did it impact your meaning, or was that a route you were sort of always going down, or how did that work?
No, I was actually not too much interested in my grandfather's work when I grew up as a child. For me, he was just grandpa, and he was such a fun personality that there was no need for anything else. I wasn't missing anything. But I was actually invited, or my sister and I were invited to a logotherapy conference. Logotherapy being the name he gave to his approach, which was the first meaning-centered approach to psychotherapy. And so he couldn't travel anymore because he was getting up there in his years and his health was failing. So he sent my sister and me to kind of represent him. And I thought, being on that airplane to Toronto, I thought, well, now's the time I should kind of know a little bit more about what he's, what my grandfather is known for in the world. And so I read Man's Search for Meaning, and I couldn't put it down. I think I had that same experience that a lot of people have. And what became clear to me was, at first, I kind of had to, I wondered, how can it be that same person that I know who was such a happy human being, who, a man who was incredibly funny, who could enjoy the littlest things and this, most ridiculous things. And how can that be the same man who went through this? And then I realized that it was probably because of that, probably because of this inner richness that he had and the ability to, for example, apply humor in situations where, there's nothing you can do. And that, again, is part of his approach, his psychotherapeutic approach, how to use humor, which is such an intrinsic human capacity, right, that allows you to put a distance between your situation that you find yourself in and puts that healthy distance in between that situation and yourself. And so it became an experience that made me understand him more as a person.
That's awesome. And by the way, that came through. I would say, we were talking about this before we came on, like one of the most prominent things about that documentary, Viktor and I, is that people cherished him for the little things, for being so down to earth, for being so pragmatic, and just someone that lights up a room. And it's amazing after reading the book to know the hell he went through, that, to maintain that just love for life is a really inspiring thing.
I'm glad you say that, because that was really my intention with that film, to kind of relate the impression of who was he as a person. And I also think it's one of the things that made him such a good therapist, because people could see, okay, if this guy has made it through this and came back, this is proof that you can go through really, really horrible situations in your life and recover, and not become mentally affected in a negative way, or you don't have to become a bitter person because of that.
And to add to that, you could actually expand. You can grow from it. It could be your growth, your opportunity to grow, which I thought was interesting, that a lot of the people that he interacted with after the war, and I don't know if they were necessarily from Auschwitz, but I know he also talked with prisoners of war from Vietnam, that they all identified that moment in captivity as a growth experience.
Exactly. And it's a very important point that you say that, because he treated everybody who wanted therapy. I mean, his name was in the phone book. He said, "I'm a doctor. I need to be available." A lot of people were surprised when they were calling from somewhere in the world, expecting a secretary to pick up the phone, and they had him on the phone. And sometimes he would do therapy over the phone. But he always said, everyone has their own Auschwitz. So for me, that, the concentration camp, the Holocaust, happened to be my lowest point in life, my confrontation with the most severe suffering. That in no way takes away anybody else's, or can't be compared to somebody else's experience. It's universal. Suffering is suffering, whether it might be internal suffering, something that you're dealing with, a mental problem, or external circumstances where you are inhibited, where you are standing with your back to the wall, and the only thing you can choose is the attitude that you adopt in that situation. And he proved that, and he proved it's possible. And actually, he actually defined that goal of psychotherapy not to be to make people happy and feel good, but to make people able to deal with the tensions and the suffering that they are confronted with in life, and not become mentally unstable or sick because of that.
Could you maybe elaborate on that? Because we were talking about that before our show a few days ago, actually. There's a line in there about the suffering, right? And you said everyone has their own Auschwitz, which was just wow, what a powerful way to put it. In the book, he talks about suffering being a gas, like taking the form of a gas, and it'll fill up your soul, no matter the extent of it. And we really didn't know what to make of that. We all had our different viewpoints from experience, but I'd be curious to get your take.
Well, this is kind of what he meant with that even if you have a small amount of suffering in your life, if this is the first time you're encountering that, it completely fills your system. And it's sort of like that, if there's a little bit of gas in a room, it will cover the whole room. It will be in every corner. It doesn't matter if it's a little bit of gas or a lot of gas. It's physics. It fills the whole room evenly. And this is what he used to compare suffering with, that if a human being is confronted with suffering and is affected by it, it will affect the whole system, the whole state changes. And so this is a universal experience, and he was always looking for ways to deal with that and to help in that situation. And again, interestingly, I mean, it's a myth that it's a misunderstanding that he kind of came out of the concentration camps with these insights. No, he had them before that. I mean, he was a student of Sigmund Freud and then of Alfred Adler. And one day he said, I disagree with my teachers, and I actually want to learn from my patients. And he was already a medical doctor. That's all he ever wanted to do. He wanted to be a doctor. And he started observing and looking at what are not the things that make us mentally unstable, not the things that make us sick, but what are the factors that come into play where people are confronted with very, very severe illnesses and difficult situations, and yet they are not mentally unstable, yet they sometimes even become more human or become the best version of themselves, and they're very resilient. What is the difference? And he identified that factor, which was meaning.
We thought at the time that his beliefs must have been a little controversial in the 50s, I would think.
Oh, well, definitely. Yeah, he was a disruptor, but he took that on. He wasn't easily frightened. On the contrary, and he knew that he had something to say and that he had come across something. I mean, this element of meaning, it's not new. You will find it everywhere in music, in poetry, and literature. It's always been around. And for some reason, it was just overlooked by those first fathers of the psychotherapeutic schools that were emerging at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century. And they were doing their thing. They were looking at where can we find the origins of a neurosis, of a disease, of any kind of illness, and find those, and then by understanding the mechanisms, we kind of already solved the problem. And there's a lot of to be said about that, and it works. Definitely, Freud opened the door to this field of even looking at the mind and the conscious and the subconscious, and that was an incredible pioneering work. But even Freud himself mentioned that he was very well aware that he was only looking at one aspect of the human being. So the problem was not that Freud was wrong necessarily, but that he generalized, or maybe the Freudians, his followers, as it so often happens, the generalization, this nothing but, and that's where you always see the kind of reductionism that's so contrary to looking at the human being as more than the sum of his parts, right? Nothing but, we're all nothing but drives and instincts that are rejected and put into the subconscious so we don't notice them, but then they're gonna hit us in the back. And then along came Adler, and a disciple of Freud, and he said, no, the central motivation is power. Freud was loved the pleasure principle, so we're just striving for pleasure. Adler said, no, it's power. And then along came my grandfather and said, I don't think it's either pleasure or power, because these are all things within us. These are just changes of states. Why would we be interested in that? Only a neurotic is so focused on what's going on inside and what are my states. Like the healthy human being, he said, is looking at the world. He's looking at things, at tasks, at other people, at values that are out there in the world, and trying to interact with the world, not abreact like Freud suggested, not react like you'll find in many psychotherapeutic schools even today, but to act into the world and to be connected with things that are important, connected with people, and to interact with that world, to make a difference, and not to be overly concerned with the effect that it has on oneself, whether it creates power or pleasure or the feeling to be important, all these subjective meanings, but to actually do something in the world and make a difference.
Wow. So, I mean, that comes throughout the entire book, and he mentions Freud and he mentions Adler, and to kind of piggyback off that, another person he talks about pretty consistently is Nietzsche. And the famous quote, "He who has a why can overcome any how." Do you see Nietzsche's presence come up consistently in the work? I mean, it seems to be such a pivotal piece of Viktor's message.
Well, a lot of things. I mean, he drew a lot from the philosophers that had come before, and Nietzsche was one of them. But Max Scheler also, I would say, even more so than Nietzsche. He saw that there were answers to be found in philosophy that psychology at the time were simply not covering. They were ignoring that. They were reducing the human being to just a bundle of, as I mentioned, drives or instincts or behavior patterns that, kind of see the human being like a machine, like a computer that just needs to be reprogrammed. And again, a lot of that is true. I mean, we have habits and things that, make us similar to machines, but we're always more than that. And this is where it's actually interesting, where it becomes interesting, where we're more than machines, we're more than animals, and where we have the ability to freely choose our path, the stand we take towards maybe the things that we've been in the character traits or the genes and all that we have, the things that we can change, but we always have the freedom to change that and to decide from one moment to the next who we want to be. And so the famous quote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow," kind of sums up one of the central points, that there will always be the question of why. Why would I want to change? Why would I want to be a different person today than I was yesterday? And if there's no good reason, then usually the change doesn't take hold. It will maybe, kind of be a half weak decision that, I'm always thinking of New Year's resolutions, right? I don't know. I'm not gonna eat any more sweets or something. And how long you're gonna do that? Maybe a day, a week, maybe a month, right? And then you're gonna fall back into your old patterns. And usually it's not because you don't know better, but the question just becomes, well, why? Why would I want to, not have the things that I like if I want them, when I want them? Is there a good enough reason? If you like, I love that one example. I had to study logotherapy just like anybody else. I had a great teacher. Her name was Elizabeth Lucas. She was one of the first generation logotherapists. And she had a patient who was a smoker, and he had tried everything to quit smoking, right? And nothing had helped. And he said, "I'm giving this one more try. And so what can you tell me?" And she asked him, "Okay, well, why do you want to stop smoking?" And he said all the usual things. "I want to be healthier." Okay. I want to live longer. I don't want to have that cough. It's a lot of money. It's a wasted money, and all these things. And she just kept asking, because none of these reasons, and she knew that very well, none of these reasons would carry. None of these reasons would last long enough when the need overcomes you. And finally, he said something. And he mentioned that he had a little daughter, and he said, well, if she sees that I'm smoking, then maybe one day she'll become a smoker too, and because I'm a bad example, and I don't want her to follow in my footsteps. And that's where she launched into action and said, "Okay, well, do you have a pack of cigarettes with you?" "Yeah." "Do you have a picture of your daughter in your wallet?" Maybe. He said, "Yeah, of course." So she said, "Hand them over to me." And he did. And she took a stapler and she stapled that picture of this man's daughter onto that pack of cigarette and gave it back to him. And that was the therapy. And he left, and he came back a year later, and he pulled out the pack of cigarettes. And he said, every time I had the urge to light up a cigarette, I saw the reason why I wanted to stop doing that. And so you see the goals, the quality of the goals, they matter. And this is maybe the most important things to have a strong why. Why do I want to act differently? Why do I want to change? And what makes a strong goal? A strong goal takes notice of the fact that people are not just there to exist and to work on their inner states and to be happy and all this stuff that we're hearing day after day from all these wellness gurus and books and self-help literature. No, a healthy human being is actually not so much concerned with themselves, but they're oriented beyond themselves onto people or things that matter. And for this man, his daughter mattered, and it mattered more than his own health and his own and the money he would waste on cigarettes, right? So here he saw, with this little intervention here, he saw the reason why he wanted to change, and it worked. So this is a lot of the therapy. This is a lot of the work actually of a logotherapist, and the work that my grandfather did was just help people realize, what are your goals? Where do you want to go in life? Is that worth it? And is that a good goal? Will it make a difference? Not just for you, but will it make a difference in the world? What are you there for? What will the world have from you? And what will remain once you're gone? So it's really much more common sense than one might think.
Interesting. Take a modern problem. I think the root problem here, I think in the States at least, it's pretty prevalent. I think it's the worldwide issue, is depression, anxiety, which is always the prequel to addiction, right? And he had mentioned addiction in the book, from a long time ago, that's been around a long time. And what I haven't found, and I've studied addiction all over the world, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Germany, France, but I never heard of logotherapy, which, my connection to my transformation was that I wanted to have a meaningful use of this second chance I had. So I wanted to do that so my kids wouldn't have the memory of someone that drank himself to death. They'd have the memory of someone that came back and stood up and came back. And the addiction industry wants to rehabilitate you. They want to restore you back to whatever that was that had those issues, I guess. And logotherapy seems like you're going to be, my distinction is like recreate yourself, bring something new into existence. Yes. Through action,
exactly.
Transformation. Exactly. And is that, I'm wondering why it's not a prevalent therapy in the States for addiction, because it's not.
Yeah, well, it's becoming. It's starting. There's a wonderful group in Chicago. It's called the Above and Beyond Family Center, and they're applying logotherapy, and a whole mix of other therapies that work with addiction. But logotherapy is at the heart of it, and they had such a sensational. I think they opened 3 or 4 years ago, and they had such a success in not just getting people to off alcohol and off the streets in many cases, but keep them there because they're better off than before. You don't just bring somebody back, to the state, as you say, to where they were before, because we're always confronted with the temptation, right? Mm-hmm. of kind of falling back into old patterns. So in order to make a difference, you want to find something more, something better. And your example is a beautiful example of that, and I congratulate you, because it's one thing to realize that, and then but you also have to walk the walk, and you did that. And this is the most powerful. All of the mechanistic approaches that kind of work on the habit level, or going back to understanding why are you acting the way you are. What happened in your childhood. All that's good, and you might even get to a point where you understand it. But then what? What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do between now and death? How does that affect it? And do you always have to understand everything in order to change it? And my grandfather would say, no, not necessarily. Sometimes understanding it and spending a lot of time understanding, the kind of the root cause of your problems makes matters even worse, because there is such a thing as re-traumatization. There is such a thing as taking away hope from people by telling them, okay, it's not your fault. It was your mom and dad or society, right?
Yeah.
And now you're the product of that, the product of environment or all those influences. And you don't have to say in this whole spiel anyway. You have to just accept that. And this can be horrible and detrimental to people who kind of accept that. And of course, it's an attempt to help, but it really makes matters worse, because again, it doesn't recognize a whole dimension that's part of the human experience, and that is the dimension of free will. My grandfather called it the noetic dimension. Kind of on top of the physical dimension, the psychological dimension. This is usually where it ends. But he said there's a third one, and this is where we have the ability to choose our attitude, to make choices despite all our influences that we've been given, and where true healing takes place.
I have one quick addition to that thought, because you talked about like environment, like we're a product of our environment, and it's for, one of the therapies and pretty popular in addiction is 12 steps, and they say you have a disease, you're an addict, and there's no cure. That's like the three cornerstones, and the one and only way, to your earlier point, anything but, is one and only way to find sobriety is that. Do you think, my question is that, I consider that a label. That's a label I didn't enjoy, so I didn't participate. Right? It's like this recession. I'm choosing not to participate in it because I'm going to make better meaning of this time.
Yeah.
When you give yourself an identity, like in therapy, in this type of therapy, a reputation to live up to type, is that the distinction between? Is that the type of thing that you would give to the smokers? Like I'm not a smoker, instead of I don't smoke anymore, or I'm quitting. What is it?
Well, this actually reminds me of Milton H. Erickson, the great, some call him the Sigmund Freud of America's Sigmund Freud, right? Who said, I don't give labels, because the psychotherapist doesn't have the luxury to come up with to kind of put that label, one size fits all on everybody. Mm-hmm. So, for example, he would refuse to tell somebody, okay, well, you are depressed. Right. Even such a common label like that, he would say, oh, you're suffering from anger against yourself. Because there are a million different ways and reasons how people, how depressions look and where the origins are. And you're exactly right. This kind of attempts, the labeling, is also taking away the focus from, okay, who's responsible? Where does my responsibility end? Nobody dismisses the fact that, for example, in alcoholism, there can be genetic factors, right? Mm-hmm. Behavior pattern factors, all that's true. But again, the generalization, it's not my fault. It's a disease, and I was hit by that, and I have nothing to add to that. That's simply not true. And human beings are always good for surprises, right? So you'll find the person who has this disease and yet says, because I choose so, I will not touch any more alcohol.
That's fantastic.
That's awesome. And so let's say were you gonna?
No, it's just the labeling is perfectly
Can I add
said.
something to that, because we're talking about philosophy? There was another great philosopher, Johann Wolfgang Goethe, and he once said, if you take man being human, of course, if you take man as he is, you make him worse. If you take man as he should be, you help him become who he can really be. And this was another quote that my grandfather embraced. And again, it's so typical for what he stood for and the point that he tried to convey. With these labels, you can't avoid to kind of put that label on that person, and that person will feel it. Okay, now I'm an alcoholic. Now I'm seen as something that doesn't take into account my free will and the choices that I can make. It's a participatory universe. We know in education, if you tell Jimmy don't be a brat, you make sure he will act like a brat, right? Because you put that out there. So if you label someone, okay, you're depressed, you're an alcoholic, this can easily backfire, because you have to look at the individual and to take the human being at their best. Why always look at the worst? Why always look at the depths and the parts that are not functioning? Why not turn the focus on what's functioning? And this, again, in logotherapy, that's all we do. Is, okay, well, here are the things you can't change. Like, here's your past, right? Okay, well, here's your future, and here are the things that you can do. Aren't they equally important? Shouldn't we look at those as well? Right? We're light and shadow. Such is life, right? And to help the person become who we expect that they can be, this is so helpful in therapy, and people will feel it. If you expect the worst, if you treat someone like a potential criminal, right, it's a whole different thing. And if you let that person feel, okay, there's good and bad in you, but I believe that you are able, that you're much more in charge and capable of being the agent of your own decisions and your own health interventions than you even know. That already has a therapeutic effect.
Can we take that idea real quick? Because this comes up a lot. So the idea of, as you should be, not as you were, removing yourself from that label. But then there becomes the question of, not having the answers, which you alluded to, and Viktor talks about in the book, the movie, like individual movie scenes where sometimes they don't really make sense until you get the one at the end. And so I guess my question is, what would your coaching be, or how would you advise someone that says, look, maybe I understand how I should be, but I don't know what the answers look like. I feel like I'm stepping out into abyss. The unknown is definitionally, not certain. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my grandfather had a very clear definition of meaning. It's not something that's created. It's not something that's given. That will be the biggest mistake if the therapist, tells you what to do. But it's a search, and that's even the title of the book, right? Man's Search for Meaning. The search in itself is already a meaningful task. So if you don't know, then to accept that and say, well, just because I don't know it right now doesn't mean I should give up looking for meaning, and maybe have the patience to eventually find out what I'll make the topic of my life, what the meaning is that I give to my life, or that I find in my life, and then go out to actualize. So it's actually remarkable, because he would look at things like boredom, that everybody else would say, okay, well, boredom is definitely a negative thing, it's a bad thing, but he would say, no, boredom is a highly meaningful thing, because it's your spirit, it's your mind telling you are letting potential meaning offerings, you let them go by, and you're wasting your life, and you should do something about it. So it's highly meaningful that you're not feeling good right now, because what you're doing is you're wasting your time. So start looking. And most of the time, it's not the fact that people are questioning does my life have a meaning or not. Freud, by the way, again, he said, if a person asks, does my life have a meaning or not? If a person doubts the meaningfulness of his or her life, that's already a symptom. That means that person is not well. Now, my grandfather said, on the contrary, if a person asks this question, does my life have a meaning or not? This is not just no sign of an illness, but this is a sign of maturity, because only a human being even asks the question, can even ask the question, what am I here for? it's an existential question. So it's a sign of maturity. You're in the same group with all philosophers who ever lived, right? And so this is something you can actually be proud of in a way. And, a lot of times even that helped people to have that insight and not to be called crazy just because they have these doubts. The doubts are part of the human existence, always have been. Not finding an answer and not finding an answer for a long, long time, that can become the problem. If you stop looking, or if you kind of resort to the lower aims of saying, okay, well, I don't know what the meaning of my life is, so at least I want to have a comfortable life, an easy life, or I'll just go for prestige or distraction, all kinds of extreme behaviors. And again, it can be a beginning of an addiction. This is kind of running away from this deep existential question that remains unanswered and that becomes this lingering void. He would call it, it's like an abyss. He called it the existential vacuum. And you find that not just in situations where people are confronted with a crisis. On the contrary, this also becomes sometimes even more predominant when people are well off, because having everything to live from does not address the question, what do we live for? So you might have all the comforts in the world, and for any dog that might be enough, but for the human being, that's where the trouble begins, because then they say, okay, well, what am I going to do with this? What am I going to do with all this free time and all this money and all these possibilities that I have?
The concept of boredom is incredible because you talk about, opportunity. And there's an accounting principle I learned years ago that kind of transformed my business life, is that the lost opportunity cost is the return that you can get on doing something other than what you're doing. And in life, there's life's lost opportunity cost. If you're bored and your brain's telling you, I guess it's telling you there's more here, right? Yeah. And you're lost a lot of the past. You could be losing the present, and the future's the biggest number. It always is, and no one accounts for that. Yeah. Everyone's always looking backwards on what went wrong instead of what can we do now? Action. I love it. Yeah. Great point.
Yeah, it's like you're driving a car, right? If you always look in the back mirror, you're not gonna, you're gonna run into the ditch.
Cool. Awesome. Do we have any questions? I think we hit them all.
Yeah, we hit most of the questions. We had a question of anything else you're working on. I think you mentioned another book or another documentary possibly. Is there anything you're working on?
Oh, there's so many things. Only 24 hours in the day. But I'm actually working on a project which is going to be very interesting. It's going to address the problems of suicide, which is, skyrocketed in the U.S., especially among the youth. Something that's very little known is that my grandfather worked in suicide prevention in the 1920s. And he actually brought the suicide rate among, teenage students. He brought it down to 0 in 1930. Because he was one of the first people to actually talk about meaning and to talk with these young people in a way that nobody else did, and it's so sad. It doesn't mean that every suicide could be prevented, or that every suicide happens because of a lack of meaning, but every suicide might well be prevented if there had been some perspective of meaning, in reach or graspable to that person. And so we're trying to develop a series that will address those issues and talk about this and try to make a little bit of a difference there.
I heard last year more people died from suicide than terror, war, and crime combined worldwide.
Yeah, it's
an
epidemic.
Yeah.
And of course, you can attribute a lot to disease. I mean, every reason for suicides there is as individual as there are people in this world. But ultimately, it's still, you cannot take away that element of choice. And so ultimately, a suicide also is a no to the question, does my life have a meaning or not?
Wow.
And this is where you can do a lot of work, and where you can make a difference in those situations where people see no other possibility to kind of open up the view a little bit and see, okay, what would it be worth for to even just remain a little longer and see what happens, and maybe your life will take a better turn.
Wow.
Oh yeah.
What an honorable path. Well, we want to thank you for taking the time. I know you're overseas, so it's probably 7 or 8 hours ahead of us. But thanks for this time, and looking forward to following your work. It's just fantastic.
Yeah, Alex, this is really, really powerful stuff, and it's going to impact a lot of people. So we appreciate you taking the time to share that with them. It means a lot.
Thank you very much.
All right,
I
everybody.
enjoyed it.
Take care.
Thanks.
Take care.